Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this little video and actually a series of videos or a couple of videos that I found to be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video that I'm going to review by that of a Dante's Boxing Nation. And then I'm going to review another video that I also found very interesting as well. And of course, for those of you that did not recently watch the fights this weekend, you of course, or for those of you that watched the fights this weekend, I should say, you know that Terence Bud Crawford, who is debatably the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the whole sport of boxing right now, some would even say the undisputed #1 pound-for-pound fighter or pound-for-pound king in the world of boxing right now, that he of course was able to beat that of the WBA champion, Mr. Israel Madrimov, at that of the 154-pound weight class. And of course, a certain amount of people are kind of wondering how big is this win really? And on top of that, how would we rank Terence Bud Crawford's performance? And of course, where does Terence Bud Crawford go from here? Because after he was able to beat Israel Madrimov by that of a unanimous decision, and a unanimous decision that I ended up agreeing with, I ended up rewatching the fight, and personally, I thought that the fight was probably about a good 7 rounds to 5. But in my personal view, and I already stated this, to be quite honest with you, even though I think Terence Bud Crawford is an exemplary fighter, I do not personally believe that it was the best performance. I thought that I could have seen a little bit more out of him, and I do understand that a little bit of Israel Madrimov's wiliness and a little bit of his sharpness of an intellect as a fighter and his game plan, of course, kind of threw Terence Bud Crawford off a little bit. That, and of course, also the gain weight and the age and the layoff, that could have also been a little bit of a factor as well. But the reason why I wanted to review this is because, of course, once again, there's always a great amount of talk about who is debatably the greatest fighter of this era. And in my view, when you talk about debatably the greatest fighter of this era, it's between Terence Bud Crawford, it's between Saul Canelo Alvarez, it's between that also of Alexander Usyk. And I do not believe that those fighters really are that much more far or behind of each other. I believe that they're pretty much about on the same level. Now, what Dante's Boxing Nation and some of the LDBC and new media channels will have you believe is that Terence Bud Crawford is way above those guys. And I just don't personally see that. And a big part of the reason why is because of Terence Bud Crawford's resume. But it is what it is. And Terence Bud Crawford, he certainly has grown his resume, especially within these past 3 fights with Sean Porter, Errol Spence Jr., and Israel Madrimov. I count all those wins as A-grade level wins. I would count the Sean Porter and the Israel Madrimov fights probably as about A- level wins. We'll see where Israel Madrimov goes, but the reason why overall, and of course the Errol Spence win, I would count probably as an A+ level win, even with Spence being off for a year. But anyways, when it comes down to it, a lot of people, of course, are trying to decide how big of a win really is this. But of course, there was also a multitude of conversations about a possibility of there being a Terence Bud Crawford versus Canelo Alvarez fight. I believe even at one point in time, I had a live debate on my channel, I believe, with the person of the YouTube channel name or the YouTube name known as Bud Gone Knockout Canelo. Of course, certainly a very impartial name. But anyways, when it comes down to it overall, once again, people have been talking about the potentiality of that fight. And like I've always stated from the beginning, that really was never a fight that interested me unless I seen Terence Bud Crawford do something at the very least at the 154-pound weight class, if not also even at the 160-pound weight class. Because if Terence Bud Crawford ends up fighting that of Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez, not only is he going to be fighting the biggest opponent of his career in terms of weight and in terms of the thickness and the girth, but on top of that, he's going to be fighting probably the most all-around talented and great and the most intelligent fighter that he's ever fought in his career. Now, if you were to listen to that of a Dante's Boxing Nation and Aki TV and some of these other guys, they'll have you believe that Canelo Alvarez is just just like Fernando Vargas or something. Like he's just this good or average Mexican fighter, but a big part of the reason why he was ranked so highly is overall because he had the complexion for the protection. And don't get it twisted, is a part of Canelo Alvarez's brand and is a part of his promotion. Is it because he's a Caucasian Hispanic from Mexico? Absolutely, that definitely is a part of it. But a big part of the problem with people like Dante's Boxing Nation and some of these other guys is that they don't really know how to separate when a fighter is ranked properly, even if they are, overall somewhat promoted because of their race or because of their look, and they don't know the difference between someone that has a legit record, like someone that of a Canelo Alvarez, or someone that may be a little bit more fraudulent. So it's very hard for them to admit whenever there's an Alexander Usyk or a Lomachenko at one point in time, or a Golovkin, or, you know, a Inoue or an Usyk or a Fury. They don't want to acknowledge those guys because they realize that if they're going to be remembered as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter and as the best fighter of their era, that they're later on going to have to hear them in debatable top 10 to top 20 pound-for-pound of all time conversations. Which means what? That eventually that they're going to be with the Sugar Ray Leonards, the Floyd Mayweathers, the Muhammad Alis, you know, that of other fighters, the Pernell Sweet Pea Whitakers. They don't want that. They do not want those fighters within the top 10, the top 20 fighters of all time. It just is what it is. That's a big part of the reason why they never acquiesce, or they will never admit overall, even if a certain fighter, you know, overall may very well deservingly be the #1 pound-for-pound fighter, they always have to try and tear that non-black fighter down. That's the way that they do things, but it is what it is. And that's also a big part of the reason why Dante and Aki TV and some of Crawford's fans, why they have to try to make some of his wins seem that much more bigger than what they actually are. And this fight, in my view, was an A-grade level win. But in my personal view, I would probably put it about on the A- level, maybe an A-grade level. But the thing is, for me, is this. We really don't know how good Israel Madrimov is. Now, some of you may be asking me the question, well, you gave Canelo Alvarez a little bit of a pass, or you were, you know, not super criticizing when he lost to Dimitri Bivol, and Bivol only had 19 fights. So when it comes to Israel Madrimov, who only had about 11 total fights, how come the same standards don't apply? Because they're not really as comparable, but for a multitude of reasons. But I'm actually going to answer that question as this video gets further along into it. So stick around and I'll answer that question, because of course that is a very relevant question. But anyways, let's get into it. Let's see what Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation has to say.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So that clip right there was the clip of the crowd that came to watch Terence Crawford versus Madrimov, a crowd that was saturated with American superstars. The only other fighter that brings out that many superstars, I'm talking about NBA players, football players, actors, etc., is Gervonta Tank Davis. With that being said,
Listen, let me state this very quickly. Because what the LDBC and the media, what they love to do once again, and, you know, I get certain people on my channel every once in a while where they say, well, who cares what Dante's Boxing Nation thinks, or these guys, why are you so obsessed with his opinion? You know, people have their own opinions, get over it. Well, at the end of the day, it's not necessarily about being obsessed about a certain opinion, but the sport of boxing is a sport that does have to be moderated in a very cautious tone, because the sport of boxing, and Dante's Boxing Nation will tell you this as well, a lot of the times it is, as Dante's Boxing Nation would say, based on race, nationality, and pride. It is a very racially motivated sport, especially because it is an individual sport. And a lot of the times I also talk about the same things in terms of tennis, and also within that of mixed martial arts, especially that of the UFC. You have to moderate it, and you have to judge it very intelligently and very carefully, because once again, many people, when they talk about their opinions, even though they claim that they're here to be objective, that's not what their true motivations actually are. And if we're just going to go off of this stuff about, well, who cares? Other people have their opinions. What are you so concerned for? No problem. But then keep that same energy when Usyk or Canelo or Inoue or someone like that, one of the great non-black fighters out there, are being ranked in the top 5 or at the #1 pound-for-pound spot, and all of a sudden you have a problem with it overall, with a difference of opinion. If we're going to play this game about, well, who cares? That's just their personal opinion, and we're not going to use any logical data or evidence overall, or any consistent standards to once again create our criteria and our list overall, then once again, no problem. But then don't bitch about ESPN's or Ring Magazine's list and then complain about how racist those websites are, when you're just going to do the same thing because you want your favorite black fighters to be wherever you want them to be. So let's not play this little game.
Spectators.
And once again, the reason why I want to commentate about this is because Dante's Boxing Nation is now talking about Terence Bud Crawford and stating that all these stars came out and blah, blah, blah. And that's a great thing. Crawford is a little bit of an attraction. That being stated, they've been trying to allege that Gervonta Tank Davis and Terence Crawford and some of these other fighters, some of their favorite fighters, have been the face of boxing now for a very long time. I think that Gervonta Tank Davis has a great debate right there with Canelo Alvarez, and I do assume that Canelo's next fight against Edgar Berlanga, or Berlanga, however you pronounce his name, the Puerto Rican contender, I do predict that more than likely Canelo will see a drop-off with those pay-per-view numbers, because nobody, including myself, really gives a shit about that fight. Nobody really wants to see that fight. And Canelo, if he is going to retain his numbers and also stay within the top 5 pound for pound, in my personal view, he is going to have to keep fighting legitimate contenders. Now, I thought that Jaime Munguia, of course, was a great contender. I thought that he was about an A- level fighter. I thought that the Jamel Charlo fight was an acceptable fight as well. But at the end of the day, he is going to have to try to fight some of the top guys at 168 if David Morrell or David Benavidez return. He's going to have to fight those guys. But once again, that being stated, Canelo Alvarez in his last fight did, I believe, about 550,000 pay-per-view buys. Not talking about if I like the fight the best for Canelo Alvarez or anything like that, but just to talk about it objectively, Canelo Alvarez did 550,000 pay-per-view buys for, that pay-per-view. And they keep trying to allege that Gervonta Tank Davis now has clearly proven that he's the main face of boxing over Canelo Alvarez because of the last fight against Ryan Garcia did 1.2 million pay-per-view buys. And although that's great, you can't necessarily compare that fight within the same standards. You cannot compare one pay-per-view completely about who is the face of boxing. You have to take a look overall and see who is getting consistent numbers. That would be like me taking a look at Terence Bud Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. and me saying that Terence Bud Crawford is a bigger draw than Gervonta Tank Davis because Gervonta Tank Davis didn't do 800,000 pay-per-view buys against Frank Martin. You don't compare those fights in that same tone. It is what it is, because Canelo, even when he's fighting opponents that are not looked at as, a complete 50-50 level fight, he's still sometimes doing anywhere from 500,000 or at times did 900,000, like with Caleb Plant. And what's very interesting is that we have not heard the pay-per-view numbers from Gervonta Tank Davis from any of these channels. Isn't that very particularly interesting? They're always so quick to criticize certain pay-per-view numbers when they need to. But then when it comes to Gervonta Tank Davis, they're quiet as a church mouse. I still have not heard the confirmed numbers for the Gervonta Tank Davis versus Frank Martin fight. And according to all the rumors, it underwhelmed with David Benavidez on the undercard. But it's very interesting how we don't see that. But Terence Bud Crawford, let me just state this really quickly about his star power, because I also see certain channels talk about Terence Bud Crawford. He doesn't get the respect he deserves in terms of the face of boxing or star power. Well, when you talk about the quote-unquote face of a sport, it's not always about who is deservingly the best of that particular sport. When you talk about NBA basketball right now, the best player on the planet right now, in my view, would have to be Nikola Jokic. Would I necessarily state that he's the face of the NBA? No, not necessarily. When you talk about tennis, Novak Djokovic, in my view, is the greatest tennis player that I've ever seen. Would I state that he was more of a face of tennis than that of a Nadal or that of a Roger Federer? No, personally, I would not. When it comes down to it, there are certain players that, overall, when you talk about, the sport of basketball, that might be greater than LeBron James. I think that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, for example, is greater than LeBron James. Would he be more of a face of the sport than LeBron James would be? Probably not, because in terms of the charisma. But the thing is that Terence Bud Crawford, even though, of course, he's an excellent fighter to watch, and he's an extraordinary fighter, no doubt about it, he's an extraordinary talent. When you talk about his level of star power, we can make all the excuses we want to in the world, but at the end of the day, Crawford just does not have elite level selling power. He just doesn't. And when you take a look at his pay-per-view numbers, whether it be with the PBC or whether it be that with Top Rank or Bob Arum, they've always been a little bit underwhelming, if not downright abysmal. When you talk about his numbers against that of a Victor Postal, he did only 50,000 pay-per-view buys. 50,000 pay-per-view buys, if even that, I believe. And then against Sean Showtime Porter in the biggest fight of Terence Bud Crawford's career, when they did the little merger right there with the PBC and Top Rank, that only did, I believe, about 250,000 pay-per-view buys. I'm not even quite sure if it did that. And for the biggest fight in Terence Bud Crawford's career, it was supposed to do way more than that, at least at the minimum 300,000 pay-per-view buys. And the fight of the decade with that of Errol Spence Jr. did not even break 900,000 pay-per-view buys. It only did about 820 to 850,000 pay-per-view buys. So once again, when we talk about Terence Bud Crawford's star power, it's obvious that he is a star, and it's obvious even more that he's an excellent and an all-time great fighter in my personal view. But let's not try to sit here and state that Terence Bud Crawford, at least in terms of star power, is some Canelo Alvarez or some of the other guys that we've seen within the history of the sport, because he's just not. All right? People can like that, they can not like that, but when you take a look at the numbers, the proof is in the pudding. And I'm not trying to tear down Terence Bud Crawford whatsoever, but there are some guys that have star power, there are some guys that just don't have it. Terence Bud Crawford is not one of those guys. He never has been.
Was there watching the fight was the legend Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. Senior, who admits that Terence Crawford is pound for pound the best fighter in the world, he was asked to give his take on a possible fight between Canelo Alvarez and Terence Crawford. And his exact words was bullshit. From where can Crawford beat Canelo? Chavez clearly feels that Crawford has no chance against Canelo Alvarez, and I think a lot of people, they feel the same way, especially...
I don't think that he really has much chance against Canelo Alvarez either, because Canelo Alvarez not only is pretty much a natural 160 pounder, but on top of that, Canelo Alvarez, like I stated, even though Dante and some of these other guys are gonna they're gonna try to convince you of otherwise, Canelo Alvarez would be the best all-around fighter that Terence Bud Crawford has ever fought. And to be honest with you, it would really even be hard for Terence Bud Crawford to win a round against Canelo Alvarez, because there would be almost no way, in my view, for him to keep Canelo Alvarez back. Crawford, after that performance that I seen over Israel Madrimov, where his power did not quite look the same. By the way, and once again, very interesting that I'm not seeing a whole lot of people talk about this, because, you know, when it came to the Fury glove accusations, it was just completely nonstop. But when it came to Terence Bud Crawford with another pair of his gloves bursting open, that which I've almost never seen before with any other fighter, a second pair of gloves bursting open, you know, overall, right before they were about to fight, you know, overall. And then on top of that, you know, both pair of gloves, you know, or both of his gloves burst open, you know, in that of the David Avanesian fight about a year earlier. You know, that's something to me, to be quite honest with you, is a decent amount more suspicious than anything that Tyson Fury overall was allegedly doing. You know, and honestly, you know, I already pointed out why I think that the Tyson Fury allegations are pretty much nonsense. But it's very interesting that nobody is talking about that.
After his performance against a much bigger, stronger Madrimov at a higher weight class.
No, Madrimov was not much bigger and not much stronger than Terence Bud Crawford. Now, when you talk about Madrimov, was he bigger than Terence Bud Crawford? Yes, he was. But was he much bigger and much stronger? No, he was not. Madrimov probably was stronger and he was bigger, definitely in terms of his thickness, no doubt about it. But once again, they were both 5'8". Terence Bud Crawford had the 6-inch reach advantage. Madrimov had the weight advantage. So at the end of the day, this fight was pretty much supposed to even out. So a certain amount of people, when they asked me the question, you know, well, Terence Crawford was able to beat Madrimov, Canelo Alvarez was not able to defeat Dimitri Bivol. So how come Terence Bud Crawford doesn't get more credit to you than Canelo Alvarez? Because not every jump in weights is completely ranked the same. That would be like me taking a look at Inoue fighting someone at the 126-pound weight class next. Overall, someone like that of a Nick Bull. And of course, he would be outweighed and outsized, definitely no doubt about it. And that would be the weight class where Inoue is starting to approach to the point to where he's going to reach his limitations. But like, that's like me, you know, if Inoue faces someone like that of a Nick Bull, someone that is a decent champion there, and someone that's a bit bigger than him, that's like me comparing that to Floyd Mayweather Jr. versus Canelo Alvarez. It just doesn't make any sense because Floyd Mayweather was outsized by about 20 pounds. But, you know, we'll compare it similarly because that was their 5th weight class that they won a belt in. That just doesn't make any sense. You can't compare it completely off of, you know, oh, that was their 5th weight class, so we have to compare it similarly. No, because when you talk about Canelo moving up to the 175-pound weight class, he was never supposed to be there in the first place. You know, now how you want to compare it maybe is when Canelo Alvarez was at the 168-pound weight division, when he fought guys maybe like a Caleb Plant or some guys like that, because that was a weight class where Canelo was probably outsized by at least one weight class. When Canelo Alvarez was at the 175-pound weight class, for a dude that is 5'7" with a 71-inch arm reach, he was never supposed to be there in the first place. Terence Bud Crawford, overall, he is only now outsized for really the first time in his career at the 154-pound weight class. If he went to 160 and fought someone like a Janabek, then you could compare it very similarly, because that would be Crawford out of his element by about 1.5 to 2 weight classes. That's how you have to compare that.
Crawford is 37 years old, and he just moved up to his 4th weight class. And that was the first time I've ever seen Crawford look outweighed. I mean, actually look like...
And Dante's Boxing Nation just told you that, exactly what I've been stating. So once again, Crawford, when you take a look at his size compared to his other weight classes or compared to the other fighters, I've already stated this. Other than this fight, Crawford has never really been in a fight to where he's been truly outsized by an opponent. And even here, I don't even know if you want to count it completely, because, you know, Madrimov, he had a 6-inch reach disadvantage over that of a Terence Bud Crawford. So, you know, the weight, of course, matters, but it's not everything. And the reach, you know, that's also very important as well. You know, especially if you're going to fight in the mid-range the whole entire time, like what an Israel Madrimov did. which in my view, was a little bit of a mistake, at least in terms of fighting as much in the mid-range as what he did. I think he needed to take a little bit more risks, and I understand that certain people will say, well, he was going to get knocked out, overall if that happened, blah, blah, blah. Well, at the end of the day, you got to risk it to get the biscuit. And if you're not courageous enough to do that, then you don't deserve to win the fight.
Like the smaller guy in the ring. During the fight, from certain angles, you could just see how much wider Madrimov's back was compared to Crawford's body. So just
well, he definitely was wider, once again, girthier and thicker than that of a Terence Bud Crawford. But once again, the size pretty much evened out because Madrimov had a 68-inch reach and Crawford had a 74-inch reach. So it pretty much about evened out. When you talk about Canelo versus guys like a Caleb Plant or a Danny Jacobs or a Callum Smith or some of these other guys, a Sergey Kovalev, a Jaime Munguia, like these are guys that actually legitimately outsize and outlengthen and outheighten Canelo Alvarez by a legitimate weight class.
Imagine him moving up 2 weight classes more. Crawford would be at a massive disadvantage. Now, if Crawford and Canelo were naturally the same weight in the same weight class, Crawford, he would knock out Canelo hands down. But he's...
Well, this is the new argument that they're going to have to prove because they can't really prove that Terence Crawford is going to beat Canelo Alvarez anymore because they realize that after this fight that there's no way that's going to happen. Not if Canelo Alvarez comes up in good form. And at the end of the day, it's very possible that Terence Bud Crawford could knock out Canelo Alvarez. But to be quite honest with you, I'm not really a big fan or a big supporter of this argument where people use this different weight class thing and they say, oh, well, if these two were naturally the same size, this fighter would knock out the other guy. Well, how do we absolutely know that? Because are we absolutely sure that if Canelo Alvarez and Terence Bud Crawford, that if they were in the same weight or if we could adjust them somewhat to the same size, in whichever way that would be, are we really sure overall that Terence Bud Crawford would win that fight? Because there are certain things that Crawford has over Canelo, of course, but there's also certain things that Canelo has over Crawford, So we can talk about that all we want to, but, at the end of the day, all that is a bunch of hearsay to where we're never really going to be able to prove that. So on top of that, we have to not only go off of their skill set, and Canelo and Crawford and Usyk's, and Inoue's skill set for their weight classes are exemplary, and they're all, once again, excellent fighters. But on top of that, their accomplishments and their resumes, well, some are about the same, but Canelo Alvarez's resume, which in my view is the most important category, that is the main factor that sticks out. When you talk about the resume compared to any of those other fighters, Canelo clearly has the best resume out of all of them.
Specializes in knocking out fighters that have never been knocked out before. A lot of them hadn't even been knocked down before. In fact, I'll go even a step further. If Madrimov...
Right, but... come on, let's, and this is another thing overall that I have to talk about. And of course, that's a great thing that Terence Bud Crawford has been able to do. But let's not sit here and act like a lot of the guys that Crawford fought at the welterweight class, or even in some of his other weight classes, were clear A-grade level fighters. Because what Dante and some of these other guys will love to do, or Terence Bud Crawford fans, what they'll love to do is that they'll love to take a look at guys like Lomachenko or Canelo or Usyk or Inoue, and they'll say, well, those guys haven't really fought elite tier level competition, so we can't put them on Terence Bud Crawford's level. Right, but what elite caliber competition has Terence Bud Crawford fought like, really? I mean, once again, other than Gamboa at 135 and then Victor Postol, and then his last 3 fights with Sean Porter, Errol Spence, and Israel Madrimov, what other A-grade level fighters has he really fought, really? Like, I watched this one video, I believe the channel was Johnboxing Pound for Pound the Best. I might even have to do a video on it. He was comparing Crawford and Inoue, and he said that Crawford has a better resume by a landslide. Well, how does he really have the better resume by a landslide? I think that you can say that he has the better resume, but to say that he has the better resume by a landslide, what opponents does he have on his resume to say that, to suggest that he has a better resume by a landslide? Because when you talk about the welterweight class, when he defeated those guys, how many of those guys were really A-grade level fighters anyway? I mean, because don't tell me it was Jose Benavidez or Aegis Kavalasquez or Jeff Horn or a washed-up Kell Brook when he was already knocked out twice or a washed-up Amir Khan when he was already knocked out on 3 separate occasions, and neither of those guys were champions, But what Dante, once again, and these guys love to do is that they love to tell you about how Canelo Alvarez fought Gennady Golovkin when he was old and washed up, and Cotto and Kovalev when they were done, but they were champions when Canelo Alvarez had actually fought them, and all those fights were looked at as dangerous fights when Canelo Alvarez fought them. When Crawford fought Kell Brook and Amir Khan, he was expected to stop those guys. All right, those guys were done. Kell Brook had not fought at 147 in years. He had already been stopped twice, and people knew that he was nowhere near the same fighter. At least Sergey the Crusher Kovalev, when he fought Canelo Alvarez, he was coming off of 2 decent wins at the light heavyweight class. and he was still a champion. That's the Kovalev that Canelo fought. No, not quite the same Kovalev that Andre SOG Ward had fought, but at the end of the day, still a good version of Kovalev. When Crawford fought Kell Brook and Amir Khan, they were done. They were chopped liver. So a lot of people don't know the difference between a fighter that is a little bit older, but they're still an A-grade level fighter, like when Klitschko fought Tyson Fury, or, overall when, certain other fighters are like a Lomachenko when he fought Devin Haney, versus a completely washed up fighter. A washed up fighter is a fighter that really is going to have no chance to win a belt anymore. Now you can say that certain fighters are a shell of themselves if you want to, depending on the situation. But it's just very interesting, who they like to give credit to depending on the situation.
And Canelo were the same weight naturally in the same weight class. Madrimov, he would beat Canelo Alvarez. Probably stop him. I don't know if he would stop him.
Well, no, he wouldn't. But that's what Dante's Boxing Nation is going to have to try to make you believe in order to get this debate across, that Terence Bud Crawford, that he didn't underperform in that fight. And in my view, he did. I was not super impressed with Crawford's performance. I thought that it was about a 7-5 fight in favor of Terence Bud Crawford. But let's be real here. Israel Madrimov is a guy with only 11 total fights on his resume. And in terms of the weight, Madrimov was the bigger guy. But combined with the reach, it pretty much was about evened out. So don't give me this crap overall once again about how Madrimov was that much bigger and he's on the same level as Dimitri Bivol and all this other stuff, and that it was similar to the Canelo versus Bivol fight or the Usyk and Tyson Fury fight, because no, it was not. Because not only was Bivol bigger than Canelo probably by a decent amount, even though yes, Canelo had gained a lot of extra muscle mass in that fight, which did not really help him out, it tired him out, but Canelo once again is a 5'7" dude. Canelo Alvarez is not really meant to be at the light heavyweight class. Crawford at least can compete at the 154-pound weight class to a degree. Now, he's outsized there by a weight class for sure, but Crawford at least rehydrates at the 160-pound weight class, and on top of that, he's 5'8" with a 74-inch arm reach. So let's not try to compare those similar situations.
He would definitely beat Canelo because Canelo, he's too predictable and he's too flat-footed. I had already told you guys going in.
Well, really the only major fault in Canelo Alvarez's game has pretty much been his feet. He's been a little bit clunky in terms of his footwork in the past. He has been at times a little bit flat-footed or a little bit slow-footed, but that actually has improved a little bit, I believe, over time. But that being stated, Terence Bud Crawford is not the perfect fighter either. Now, he has better feet than Canelo Alvarez, but in terms of the things, in terms of the skill set, or in terms of overall, once again, what Canelo would beat Terence Bud Crawford in, Canelo Alvarez is an all-around better defensive fighter than what a Terence Bud Crawford is. You even seen it in this last fight against Israel Madrimov. Crawford at times does get hit a little bit too often for his own good. Now, Canelo can get hit, but overall, he's a decent amount harder to hit, usually at his best. Now, he has slowed down a little bit more, but Canelo Alvarez is extremely difficult to catch flush, and on top of that, he has a better chin than that of a Terence Bud Crawford. That being said, I also would state that Terence Bud Crawford has better speed, at least for his weight classes, than what Canelo Alvarez does. But there's certain things that Canelo beats Terence Bud Crawford in as well. Dante will try to make it seem like this is just unanimous and that Crawford beats him in every single category. But to be quite honest with you, that's not the case. Canelo Alvarez overall is actually better with movement than Terence Bud Crawford, at least in terms of the slipping and in terms of avoiding punches, at least inside the range. If you take a look at Terence Bud Crawford versus Sean Porter and Israel Madrimov, he actually gets hit with inside punches a little bit too often. That being stated, once again, in terms of the feet, Crawford does have the edge in that category. But once again, Dante and a lot of these guys, they want to tell you that Crawford is so far ahead of certain guys like Usyk and Canelo. Not only is he not far ahead of them in terms of resume or accomplishments, but he's definitely not far ahead of them overall, at least in terms of Canelo, in terms of the resume and the amount of opponents or the type of opponents that he's fought. Just is what it is.
To this fight, that this is going to be a very difficult fight for Terence.
And once again, Dante and these guys, they try to make it seem like Canelo is just some Fernando Vargas. You cannot beat guys like Cotto and Jamel Charlo and, get the win over Lara. Yes, that was a fight that I thought could have went either way, but they gave it to Canelo. Lara could have threw more within that fight. It is what it is. They gave it to Canelo. At the end of the day, he got the win, and I think that it was a deserved win, at least a win that could have went either way. He beat Gennady Golovkin in the rematch. He beat Sergey the Crusher Kovalev. He beat Jaime Munguia and Billy Joe Saunders. He beat Caleb Plant. He beat that of a Callum Smith. He beats, some of the other guys there, and Billy Joe Saunders, like I said, and some of the other guys, at Danny Jacobs. He beat Danny Jacobs, and he beat some other guys. And a lot of these guys actually were bigger than Canelo Alvarez. They were taller than him. They were lengthier than him. So once again, you cannot be 5'7" with a 71-inch arm reach, win every single one of those fights, and also give Dimitri Bivol the toughest fight of his career when he's fought light heavyweights and cruiserweights and decently talented light heavyweights and cruiserweights, and not be an all-time greatly skilled fighter. It's not possible.
Crawford when it comes to Madrimov. This man has over 350 amateur fights. He's from Uzbekistan, which are some of the best amateur fighters. In recent years, next to Cuba, they've been winning the most gold medals. Madrimov, who actually helped Arthur Beterbiev prepare for Canelo, he sparred with him, has a very high boxing IQ, as we've seen in the Crawford.
Well, first of all, sir, you're talking about Dimitri Bivol. But anyways, secondly, when it comes down to, that's great that Uzbekistan has a great amateur pedigree, but once again, it's just very interesting, how they love, to put that for their advantage when they want to make certain debates, but then when it comes to other debates, they won't. So when it comes to that of Lomachenko, once again, having a certain amount of fights, they'll love to say that Madrimov is a super dangerous fighter and just as good as Dimitri Bivol. Even Dante's Boxing Nation has Dimitri Bivol within his top 3 to top 5 pound for pound. That's Dante's Boxing Nation's own rankings when it comes down to it. So he's trying to compare Israel Madrimov to a top 10 level pound for pound fighter, and he's just not. But it's just very interesting how, he'll give those guys praise, especially when they can knock off someone like a Canelo Alvarez or make the debate stronger for Crawford. But then when it came to Vasily Lomachenko, what was all the debate, about when he was #1 pound for pound? Well, he can't be #1 pound for pound because he only has about 11 or 12 total fights. So once again, why all of a sudden the change in energy?
Fight. Although Madrimov didn't really let his hands go that much in the Crawford fight, and the reason why he didn't let his hands go that much, because he knew that Crawford was going to open up with counters and possibly catch him with something and knock him out. He was aware of this. In fact, there were a couple times when Madrimov was actually hurt in the fight, but every time he got hurt, he would tie up Crawford right away, which is pretty ironic because Crawford is the smaller guy, the much smaller guy. You would expect the...
No, Terence, but Crawford is not the much smaller guy. And once again, this has to be addressed because what Dante's Boxing Nation is trying to do is that he's trying to compare this to the Dimitri Bivol situation with Canelo Alvarez, and no, it is not a similar situation. Okay, it is what it is, because not only was Bivol more experienced against top level contenders in that of the light heavyweight class, and I'm not quite sure if I'm going to review another video after this, so I'll just state this point really quickly, because some people overall be like, well, how come overall Dimitri Bivol, you don't hold the same standards because Bivol only had 19 fights, right? But the thing is with Bivol is that he was actually able to defeat some of the top contenders before he got to Canelo Alvarez. He was able to dominate and make John Pascal look, weak, a former light heavyweight champion, I believe. He was able to make Joe Smith Jr., a former light heavyweight champion, look very destitute. He was able to make them overall look, pretty much like an amateur. We don't know how good Israel Madrimov is. These guys are just trying to put him on a level to where we don't know where he actually is. Israel Madrimov did not get through Tim Tszyu or get through Pangastano or get through Jamel Charlo or get through any of those top contenders or even an Erickson Lubin or a Sebastian Fundora or anyone like that in order to win his title. He beat a bunch of people that nobody would know. So once again, we don't know how good he is. Now, could he potentially be as good as Dimitri Bivol? It's possible, but he needs to show overall once again once he gets in the ring with certain guys. And once again, that's where it's going to be interesting to see if Madrimov can beat some of these other top grade contenders because we don't know how good this guy actually is.
Small guys.
Even Bivol, before he fought Canelo Alvarez, we knew somewhat how good he was because once again, he had dominated overall the likes of Joe Smith Jr. and some of these other guys. Even when Dimitri Bivol overall before he fought Canelo, he was already looked at as the second best heavyweight on the the second best light heavyweight on the planet, right behind Artur Beterbiev, and people were already talking about that big fight between Bivol and Beterbiev. People are already talking about it. So once again, people knew how good Dimitri Bivol actually was. No one was talking about Israel Madrimov before this about him legitimately being the best 154 pounder there. Nobody was talking about him like that.
Be tying up the big guy. That just further shows you how dangerous Crawford is, even at 154, at a weight disadvantage or size disadvantage. But when it comes to Crawford moving up 2 more weight classes to fight Canelo at 168, that might be too much. Crawford is hands down the better fighter in every department, but he would put himself at a massive disadvantage.
No, Terence Bud Crawford is not hands down the better fighter in every single department, but it is what it is. But that being stated, once again, if you wanted to debate that Crawford is all around more skilled than Canelo Alvarez, you certainly have your debate there. That being stated, if you wanted to debate someone like a Usyk or a Canelo Alvarez being the most skilled of their generation and all around the best of their generation or the greatest of their generation, you could debate that as well. I think that Crawford, Usyk, and Canelo are all right there with each other. I just don't like this debate about how Terence Bud Crawford is so far in ahead of everybody else, because I just don't think that he has the resume. And on top of that, in terms of the skill set, he's a great fighter, but I don't think that he's quite the fighter as what a Floyd Mayweather Jr. was, or someone like that. But I do think overall, once again, that he's close. I think that, fighters like Canelo and Usyk and Crawford, I think that, they're exemplary fighters. Like I said, they're excellent fighters, and they definitely deserve a lot of credit.
Advantage to move all the way up to 168. Turkey Al-Sheikh, he already said that if they can't make the Crawford versus Canelo Alvarez fight, he wants to make Crawford versus Virgil Ortiz, which would be a huge fight, especially considering the fact that in the sport of boxing, race sells. That's why I always tell you guys, the sport is based on race, nationality, and pride.
That would be a very big fight, but to be quite honest with you, I'm not really quite sure if that would be a good idea for Terence Bud Crawford at this point in time in his career. He still looks very good, but Virgil Ortiz is a very dangerous type of opponent. And on top of that, Terence Bud Crawford is getting up there in age. Terence Bud Crawford is going to turn 37 years old next year. So I'm not really quite sure if I'm Terence Bud Crawford, if that's the fight that I'm going to go after next. Of course, I don't choose the man's career. He can do whatever he wants to. But I would like to see Terence Bud Crawford try to unify the 154-pound weight class.
That's why Floyd Mayweather made a career beating up Mexican fighters on Mexican holidays, because he knew the Mexicans would come out and support their fighter and actually start to believe that the Mexican fighter has a chance of winning the fight just off of Mexican pride alone. I remember Juan Manuel Marquez. He was asked, why is he going to beat Floyd Mayweather? And Marquez, he said, I'm going to beat him because I'm Mexican. And that's the kind of pride that sells a fight. I think when it comes to Terence Crawford, what he should do, if he's not going to fight against Canelo Alvarez, he should set his sights on being a third division undisputed champion at 154 and then retire. And then
I agree. And to be quite honest with you, in my personal view, I don't think that there's any reason for Canelo Alvarez versus Terence Bud Crawford to happen. I just don't think that there is. Because I think, once again, that we pretty much got the answer that we needed to already. And I know that a certain amount of people are saying, well, Madrimov, he moved in a different way than what Canelo Alvarez does. Just because he looked bad against, or didn't look as good against Madrimov, doesn't mean that he's going to lose against Canelo Alvarez. Canelo Alvarez is going to be, once again, not only is he going to be clearly the most powerful fighter that Terence Bud Crawford has ever fought, and the fighter overall that has the best all-around chin, he is going to be the most skilled and complete fighter that Terence Bud Crawford has ever fought in his career. I promise you that. Because when you talk about Canelo versus Errol Spence Jr., Canelo is an all-around better and more skilled and greater and more intelligent fighter than Errol Spence Jr. Yes, he is. He has better head movement. He has better counterpunching ability, way better counterpunching ability when it comes down to it overall. He has better defense when it comes down to it. Canelo Alvarez, once again, he is not a fighter to be trounced with. Once again, you cannot win the fights that he's won, be his stature, and win belts from 154 all the way up to 175 pounds and not be an all-time great fighter. That fight, in my personal view, wouldn't even be competitive, and Crawford would be lucky to even make it out of the first half of the fight.
Have Jaron Ennis. Jaron is fighting at 147. Now, I don't think Jaron wants to move up to 154, but if...
And this is going to be very interesting because there really is no reason for the Canelo versus Crawford fight to really happen anymore when it comes down to it. So once again, Terence Crawford potentially could fight that of a Jaron Boots-Ennis. We'll see if he wants to take the fight.
Ron does move up to 154. I think he should fight for one of the belts, and then once he wins a belt, fight Terence Crawford for undisputed. Now, if Terence Crawford was younger, I would say that Jaron Ennis, he should become undisputed at 147, then move up to 154 and fight Terence Crawford for all the belts. With that being said, I'm going to wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one. All right, now check this out, guys.
But anyways, that pretty much is about it for this video. I will probably review the Johnboxing pound for pound video right now, just so I can clarify a couple things. And then we'll get this video wrapped up. Okay, so this is going to be Johnboxing pound for pound the best, and he's going to be talking about, once again, this situation. But anyways, let's get straight into it.
P is dragging Terence. So IBFP is dragging Terence Crawford for his performance against Israel Madrimov. And one of IBFP's criticism towards Terence Crawford was that he struggled against, or he went life and death against a guy with only 10 fights. Okay. And because of that, he doesn't beat Canelo. Listen, I don't think Crawford beats Canelo because of size. It's common sense.
Well, here's the thing for me when we talk about this Terence Bud Crawford thing, and I understand, a lot of Crawford fans or a lot of people, they'll state that, well, why are we being so hard on Terence Bud Crawford if we're going to give Canelo Alvarez a slight pass for losing to Dimitri Bivol the way that he did, because Bivol only had about 19 to 20 fights on his record? Why are we, giving him, a total pass for that, but Crawford doesn't get a pass for this? Well, in my view, Canelo Alvarez does deserve a little bit more of a pass for losing to Bivol than what Crawford does a little bit here. Because at the end of the day, once again, yes, there was a size advantage for Madrimov, but once again, give me a break a little bit, because Crawford had about a 6-inch reach advantage, and it's not like he's a Floyd Mayweather. Terence Bud Crawford naturally rehydrates at about 160 pounds. So the size was not overall as much as what people are really trying to say that it is, and it's not like, it's not like this was when Floyd Mayweather fought that of Amigo Cotto, and Cotto was already a multiple weight division champion, a 3-weight division champion, and clearly a spectacular fighter in pretty much whatever weight class that he fought in. We don't really know how good Madrimov is. So people, and so on top of that, in terms of professional boxing against elite caliber competition, or at least toughened competition, he really was not that experienced, because who can you really say that he ever fought? At least with Dimitri Bivol, we can say that he fought former champions or future champions like that of a Joe Smith Jr. or John Pascal. Who the hell did Israel Madrimov fight? So that's the reason overall, once again, why it's a little bit different. You have to compare it differently, because not only was Bivol more experienced to where it mattered in terms of actual championship level experience, but on top of that, once again, when it comes down to it, Canelo and Bivol, they were completely different sizes. Canelo Alvarez never belonged at that weight class in the first place. He really probably was outsized by about 1.5 to 2 weight classes in that fight. He was more bloated up for that fight, sure, overall to, gain a little bit of power and more muscle mass for the, the light heavyweight class. But it didn't really do him any favors, because Bivol proved to be a very worthy opponent. And on top of that, it just exhausted Canelo Alvarez. So once again, you can't really compare it. It's not really a similar situation. What this situation would be comparable to is if Canelo Alvarez went up in weight, fought someone like a Billy Joe Saunders and, basically had a 7 rounds to 5 fight with him. That's what it would be similar to. Now, of course, Israel Madrimov, he has more power in his hands than what a Billy Joe Saunders has. But Billy Joe Saunders, of course, also, he's a very wily and he's a very smart fighter. And he was one of the top A-grade level fighters at 160.
But if Crawford and Canelo were the same size, Crawford annihilates Canelo Alvarez. But I'm living in reality here.
Well, once again, people are, they're stating that, but to be quite honest with you, there's really no extra way to prove that. People, of course, are talking about that overall, once again, as if Crawford would completely dominate Canelo if they're in the same weight class. Well, that's possible, but once again, if we're also going to judge Terence Bud Crawford on some of his flaws, Terence Bud Crawford is not the greatest defensive fighter of all time. He is not. It is what it is. He does get hit a little bit too much, in certain exchanges. He also does not have the strongest chin. He can be hurt, all right, when it comes down to it. And on top of that, within this fight, it did look like he had a problem finding certain offensive opportunities.
20 pounds is a lot of weight for a boxer to put on. So no, Terence Crawford does not beat Canelo because of size.
Well, Crawford doesn't beat him because of size with the combined skill set. But that being stated, if they were more similar size, who would win? Who knows? But once again, I'm not always a big fan of that judger, because fighters look different in terms of different weight classes, the heavier or the lighter that they are. And on top of that, I don't think that Terence Bud Crawford, even if you would count him as more skilled than Canelo Alvarez, I really don't think that it's really that far of a separation. And then when we talk about the physical attributes, when you want to talk about who has more power for their particular weight classes, I mean, to be honest, that's a little bit of a toss-up, but I would probably even say Canelo Alvarez. Because when Canelo punched out at Bivol, Bivol actually stated that Canelo, when he got hit by Canelo, that was the hardest that he had ever been hit. And that was with him being in the ring with guys like Joe Smith Jr. and Gilberto Zurdo Ramirez. you know, because I believe that he said it after the Zurdo Ramirez fight.
If they were the same size, Crawford.
And then, of course, hand speed, I would give to that of a Terence Bud Crawford. Stamina, of course, I also would give to that of a Terence Bud Crawford. Chin, I would give to that of a Canelo Alvarez. You know, adaptability. To be honest with you, they're both great adaptable fighters. I would maybe give that slight edge to Terence Bud Crawford. Defense, I would give to that of Canelo Alvarez. You know, when you talk about slipping and avoiding punches, you know, within the mid-range, I would give that to Canelo Alvarez. The feats I would give to that of a Terence Bud Crawford. So once again, you know, you could debate about which fighter in your personal view is more skilled. You know, but once again, it's, you know, very close in my personal view. It's definitely not in every single category like what people are trying to make it out to be.
Annihilates Canelo Alvarez. Okay? But IBFP, he's basically saying that this fight here should tell everybody that Crawford doesn't beat Canelo because Terence Crawford had a competitive fight with a fighter who only had 10 fights. Well, if we're going to use that logic to determine whether if a fighter beats another fighter, then we have to use that same logic with Canelo, because it was Canelo Alvarez who lost to a fighter that only had 19 fights.
Right, but once again, and this is the reason why you can't compare it just like this, because when you talk about certain fighters, for example, you have to take a look at, you know, not only their amateur program, but you also have to take a look at who they fought in professional boxing. You know, for Vasily Lomachenko, for example, when you take a look at his first 11 fights, he was beating champion after champion after champion after champion. That's why his resume had to be counted as a little bit greater than most other fighters that only had about 11 fights. You know, and that's that really shouldn't be that hard to see, but it is what it is. When you talk about Madrimov, he ended up winning the title because of a vacancy. Now, Bivol may have won it because of a vacancy as well. I cannot, you know, personally remember, you know, but he was able to beat some of the top contenders, you know, within that light heavyweight class afterwards, like certain fighters that may have even been ranked within the top 5. I don't think Madrimov even beat anyone that would have been within the top 10. So that was the issue. Or at least certainly not someone within the top 5.
To that fight with Dimitri Bivol, Canelo Alvarez had 60 fights, and he lost to a fighter with only 19 fights. And let's not talk about...
Yes, he did, but once again, not only was Canelo Alvarez way more outsized against Dimitri Bivol than what Crawford was against Madrimov, but on top of that, once again, Bivol is more experienced in professional boxing and more proven than what a Madrimov is. So we cannot compare those within similar standards because they're not the same.
Dimitri Bivol being this top pound-for-pound fighter before Canelo Alvarez fought him. Dimitri Bivol wasn't even a conversation. It was Artebet who everybody was talking about.
Well, Dimitri Bivol was being talked about. And that's why a lot of people, including myself, when Canelo Alvarez took that fight, they did think that it was a very dangerous fight. It's just that Dimitri Bivol was not the most marketable. You know, so that's why that pay-per-view did not do extremely well, because a lot of Eastern European fighters, especially, they're not the most well-known. But let's not, you know, downplay, you know, Dimitri Bivol. Dimitri Bivol was known as debatably the second best light heavyweight in the world, right behind Artebet, even when Canelo Alvarez was about to fight him. So let's not play that. You know, other than Dante's Boxing Nation and some of these other guys, no one was really ever stating, wow, Israel Madrimov is for sure the best 154-pounder in the world. People were starting to take a look at Tim Tszyu, and they were starting to take a look at some of the other guys potentially there, but Madrimov kind of came out of the woodwork. Now, could he beat some of those guys? He absolutely could. He seems like a relatively decently skilled fighter, you know, but when it comes down to it, you know, overall, we don't really know how good those fighters actually are. Or at least we don't know how good a Israel Madrimov is.
Canelo signed to fight Dimitri Bivol. Everybody was asking, why him? Why not fight Artebet? Nobody knew how good Dimitri Bivol until he fought Canelo. So let's not sit up here and...
Well, people, you know, they didn't know how good he actually was until he fought Canelo Alvarez. But let's not sit here and act like Dimitri Bivol was just some unknown dude like an Israel Madrimov was for Terence Bud Crawford. Because people did not really know what to think of Israel Madrimov heading into this fight. People already knew that Dimitri Bivol was a real deal fighter. So no, sir, you're actually incorrect.
Say, well, John Boxing, Dimitri Bivol you didn't know if he was pound for pound or not. That's what I'm trying to...
Well, Bivol would have not been top 10 pound for pound because he didn't have the accomplishments nor the resume to be there. but he was in the conversation for the top 20 pound for pound. The thing is with Israel Madrimov is that, once again, he had fought no known opponents within that weight class. None, other than one Russian fighter. And to be honest with you, if you can tell me his name, I'd give you $100. Because once again, nobody knows any of the opponents that Israel Madrimov has fought. So let's not sit here and try to act like, once again, they're similar situations.
So we're not going to sit here and say, well, Dmitry Bivol was way better than Israel Madrimov. You're not going to sit here and say you knew that. You knew
Dmitry Bivol is a better fighter than that of Israel Madrimov. He's certainly a more proven fighter than Israel Madrimov. So let's stop playing this game and acting like Israel Madrimov and Dmitry Bivol are in similar situations, because they're not.
he was that good before he fought Canelo. No, you found out that he was that good when he spanked Canelo. So this whole notion that Terence Crawford can't beat another fighter because he had a competitive fight with someone with 10 fights, it's, to me, I think it's selective criticism. Boxing fans just having selective criticism. Because if you're going to criticize Crawford for having a competitive fight with someone with 10 fights, then you have to be disrespecting a fighter like Canelo, who had 60 fights, losing to a guy with only 19 fights.
Right, but once again, sir, they're not that comparable. And I've already listed the reasons why that is. Bivol was more experienced. He also was a decent amount bigger than Canelo, especially in terms of the height for that fight. When it came down to it, Canelo never belonged at that weight class. Once again, the only way that you could really compare that, once again, is if Crawford were to move up to 160 and fought someone like that of a Janabek. That's really the only possible way that you can really compare that. Now, if Crawford can go up and beat Janabek, then in my view, he'll be able to do something that Canelo Alvarez was not able to do. But just because Crawford moved to his fourth weight class does not mean that he was as outsized overall at his fourth weight class as what Canelo Alvarez was, and fought an opponent that was just as good as the opponent that Canelo Alvarez fought at his fourth weight class. No, sir, that is incorrect.
Big difference here. Canelo lost. Terence Crawford still won.
Right, Terence Bud Crawford won over a fighter that was not as outsized nor as good or accomplished overall as what Dmitry Bivol was for Canelo Alvarez. So it is what it is. Once again, if we're going to be comparing weight classes, then why is Naoya Inoue not the number one pound per pound fighter? Yes, he recently got knocked down in his most recent fight against that of a Louis Nery. But if we're going to be comparing fourth weight classes, then Naoya Inoue would probably have debatably the best run that I've seen, at least in recent years, of a fighter that has been a champion in 4 different weight classes. So then why is Naoya Inoue not remembered as the number one pound per pound fighter right now? Because of his pure level dominance, when it comes down to it. But then all of a sudden, their competition matters.
He won by unanimous decision. Canelo lost by unanimous decision, meaning he didn't win. He only won maybe 3 or 4 rounds, if that. Like I said, I don't.
And once again, I've already stated this. Canelo Alvarez, and yes, he is correct. Canelo really only won about 3 or 4 rounds against that of Dmitry Bivol. But that goes to show you once again how great of a fighter that Canelo Alvarez actually has to be to not only survive that fight, but to actually win 3 or 4 rounds against a guy that he had no business even being in the ring against, in that of a Dmitry Bivol. No business whatsoever. When you have fighters like Joe Smith Jr. and John Pascal, who really couldn't even win a round against Dmitry Bivol, or guys even like a Gilberto Zeta Ramirez, who's really a damn cruiserweight in there, and he can't even win a single round against Dmitry Bivol. The dude that was able to give Dmitry Bivol his hardest fight was a guy that really is a middleweight fighter and 5'7". That's the guy that was able to give him his toughest fight.
I believe Terence Crawford beats Canelo Alvarez because of size. Size matters. Canelo is just far too big for Terence Crawford.
I think that he's far too big once again, and I think that the skill set would also be a little bit too much combined with the size. Now, if they were overall the same size, I'm not really quite sure who would win. I would maybe bet on Terence Bud Crawford just because Canelo Alvarez is a guy that does not really prefer fighters that love to move around the ring and have fast and quick feet. But to be fair, Canelo Alvarez has defeated some fighters or gotten the win over fighters that do have quicker feet or can box like that, a little bit like an Araceli Lara, or that of a Danny Jacobs to a degree, or that of a Billy Joe Saunders or a Caleb Plant. Now, of course, Crawford's power level is different than pretty much any one of those fighters, and I think that he's a better fighter than any one of those fighters, but I don't know. It would be an interesting fight if you can somewhat make them the same size.
But because I believe Canelo Alvarez beats Terence Crawford because of size, doesn't mean that I think that Canelo Alvarez is a better fighter than Terence Crawford, because he's not.
Well, in my view, that's debatable.
If Terence Crawford and Canelo Alvarez were the exact same size, Terence Crawford annihilates this man badly.
Well, we'll never know that. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. I just thought that was very particularly interesting. But that pretty much is about it for the conversation today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see overall what Terence Bud Crawford does next. But I do not believe that the Canelo Alvarez fight is the fight that needs to happen next. We'll see. But I also wanted to do that because not only is that going to answer certain questions overall that certain people may have about this subject, at least on my channel, but, you know, I thought that I would talk about it because, once again, the Crawford and Madrimov fight and the Canelo and Bivol fight, it's really not as comparable as what a lot of people are trying to make it. But it is what it is. Anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.